Quick disclaimer, although I will be heavily criticizing and nitpicking this anime, I did actually enjoy watching it. However, there were some details that bothered me that I kind of wanted to discuss. Spoiler warning, I will be going over the specific scenes and story arcs in this video. If you don't want to be spoiled on season 1, this video is not for you. If you don't mind spoilers, or have already seen Moriarty the Patriot, then hey, hope you guys enjoyed it as much as myself, if not more. However, Moriarty the Patriot is an anime I found by rage-filled dyslexia. I initially read the title as Moriarty the Poirot, and anyone who knows who Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot is would understand why I thought that title sounded disgusting. Then after some time and rereading the title, I realized what the name actually was and felt like an idiot. By name, the first 2 minutes of screen time, this show gives the idea that on first impressions, this is a show about Moriarty, Sherlock Holmes' most recognizable foe. For someone like me, I personally love villains in stories like these. My favorite fictional character is Ursula from The Little Mermaid, so you can see why this kind of story would draw me in. Villains can tell a lot about the world they are in and offer a nice look into the world as a whole. Most narrated stories that we know are all narrated from a general hero's perspective. This isn't inherently bad. I mean, that frame of mind has been around for the longest time and it sells. And they say, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. But beginning with the story arcs, the show opens up with a short, clear-cut kidnapping mystery to introduce us to Moriarty and his two brothers. After that, we get 2 episodes of backstory, which I hate backstory episodes in first seasons, but we'll skip past that part. It goes over how Moriarty met his brothers and gives a better explanation on what their goals are for the series. After that, we get to see Moriarty beginning his plans to discredit the evil nobles of the country, and up until this point, the show was a little slow. It was generic anime pacing tropes, an episode that I'm going to rip into later, and then the noatic arc begins. This is where the show really begins to pick up and where they introduce Sherlock Holmes. It gets better, becomes more interesting, and things look so much better. However, after the show begins to pick up, we switch sides. This show, which is titled Moriarty the Patriot, becomes focused on Sherlock Holmes' own narrative. There isn't anything wrong with this, except we start seeing the narrative completely from Sherlock's point of view, and we don't see anything as Moriarty. For 2 episodes, we focus solely on a retelling of a study in Scarlet. From Holmes' perspective, minus a few cameos from the protagonist group, for me this is disheartening, honestly. I wanted to see how Moriarty would have set up the study in Scarlet story, how Moriarty kept himself and watched Holmes, his lab rat, run through this carefully crafted maze. I wanted to see Moriarty plan ahead. I wanted to see the study of Scarlet through a new perspective. And instead, the writers retold a study in Scarlet, and that's it. It's a safe bet, yes, but I was disappointed all the same. It's nice they decided to flesh out Sherlock, but originally I'm here for Moriarty. He's the title character. I'm here to see his side of the story. Instead, we got to see Holmes' story unfold. After that, we still focused on Holmes, witness a murder on a train where Moriarty and Holmes team up. Moriarty cheats the system, and we all go home. There is also an episode where Moriarty helps a college kid look for his dead lover, like a good teacher, and it's nothing special or interesting, actually. However, I feel like now we need to talk about the real reason I made this video. Now, as anyone who has read a Sherlock Holmes book, seen a movie, or any type of media related to this, they will know this is a detective story. We came here to see smart people do smart things. However, as anyone who's seen Stephen Moffat's Sherlock before, or H. Bomberguy's review of it, this series has a similar effect at times. Although there are brief moments of real planning or detective work, it's poorly executed for the most part. Allow me to explain before you crucify me. In deductive reasoning, we like to see reasons as to why people deduce certain ideas. It's that exact reason people are so obsessed with a good mystery story. And in a series like this, we want to see what the reasoning and evidence displayed was, or is. If I said I could tell what you've done in the past 5 hours, you'd ask why I thought whatever I thought. You wouldn't normally just hear me say, oh, you've cheated on your wife, and go, yup, you got me. No, you'd ask questions, and probably try to save face and dismiss those claims. Then you'd ask if I had any evidence or reason why I would think or say such a thing. However, this show rarely gives any hint to the audience what's going on, and we learn as things progress. For example, in the noatic, a big ship, totally not referring to Titanic with Noah spliced in its name, Sherlock is showing off a bunch of ladies his deductive reasoning. We learn this because he deduces that Moriarty is a university math teacher. His reasoning is that when Moriarty took a step back to look at the staircase in the noatic, it was for him to analyze and see if the staircase followed the Hey guys, post-editing Quail here. I was an idiot and messed up the Pythagorean theorem with the Fibonacci sequence, so I'm just going to point it out that Sherlock was talking about the fact that Moriarty was looking at the staircase because it followed a certain sequence, specifically the Fibonacci sequence, and that's why he's looking at the staircase. I just wanted to point that out there because yes, I'm an idiot and I just needed to clear that real quick. But at the time would make him a high-level scholar for his age. Although it's not the most concrete, at least Sherlock gave a reason to show us why he thought so. Moriarty bites back with his own deductions, and there aren't any reasons given. Like, seriously, nothing. Now, in real life, most people would act tough and deny any claims, especially anything that felt defamatory or mean-spirited. But this is fiction, and instead of denying it, Sherlock's science admits to all of it. Now, Moriarty makes some deductions that even I could think up a reasoning for, so allow me to. One deduction is that Sherlock plays the violin. Moriarty doesn't say how he sees or thinks this. Probably just because the writers couldn't be bothered into thinking of any good reason. But for anyone who knows a few details of Sherlock Holmes, we know he plays the violin. But we're the audience, what about the people aboard the ship? Well, here's how I would have had Moriarty explain this part. From the calluses on your left hand's fingers, I'd say you play a stringed instrument. However, you don't appear to have any on your right hand. Given how they have formed from the potential string size and diameter, it would be a smaller, handheld string instrument. Of note as well, there's a small crease near the left side of both your jacket and shirt's collars, something pressed in by long sessions of either a viola or a violin. However, as you don't seem very interested in the more upbeat viola, I would say you've opted for the more common and grounded violin. Simple, but understandable, and it gives observable BS details that at least sound reasonable, that anybody could find or understand. That sounds realistic. Or how about the drug abuse deduction? He straight up just says, oh, is that opioid addiction I see on you? At the very least, you could say something from around the lines of, from the trace amounts of sweat visible on your collar, even though it is a cool evening on the ship, your dilated pupils, and the bags under your eyes indicating of lack of sleep, I'd like to inquire that you are in recovery from some sort of substance abuse, Mr. Holmes. There, I gave a reason. And visible signs of withdrawal from drug abuse that would make it seem like a reasonable, yet still a lackluster clue. Although we can dispute whether withdrawal signs from drugs are the same today as back then, at least those reasons, there's something we can instantly infer and give credible reasoning to Moriarty's deductions. And therein lies a big reason why I would compare this show to Stephen Moffat's Sherlock series. There is a deduction, and we could have reasons behind them, but instead we're told this, given no reason why or how to deduce these things, and we just need to think there's something there that these geniuses see because us mortals just don't get it. It doesn't matter if the reasons are completely good or bad, but it's the fact that there isn't any reasons that make the scene feel hollow. We see Sherlock give a quote-unquote reasonable deduction, but from there, do we just need to assume Moriarty just knows things? And does Sherlock's job better? I mean, originally, Moriarty is the antagonist, but again, there isn't inherently anything wrong with the scene. Moreover, it's the lack of detail that makes it feel hollow. Allow me to turn to a show that really plays with the idea of deduction for evidence. In the TV series called Psych, shout out if you know this, we follow Sean Spencer, a quote-unquote psychic detective, and his lifelong friend, Burton Guster. Sean isn't really psychic. Instead, his father, a former police officer, taught Sean to be extremely observant. In the show, there are a constant amount of scenes where we follow Sean's line of sight as he finds subtle clues and evidence that helps him solve the case in each episode. Let's contrast that to Stephen Moffat's Sherlock. Sherlock spends time seeing things, but rarely is it something that we understand. Most of the time, we see Sherlock in his mind palace, thinking of things, shaking his head, moving his hands, and making astute observations, but rarely is it something that the viewer can easily follow. In Psych, we see what Sean is focusing on, and sometimes see a recreation in lower quality of what in his mind of what might have happened or transpired. We see inside Sean's mind, and we feel like we are solving the crime ourselves as we go along and see him go through the evidence in his mind. The difference is, one way shows a reasonable way of gathering evidence as Sherlock Holmes would have, astute observation and mental recreation to piece together the evidence gathered to make his assumption. The other relies on looking smart. Kind of like how I use big vocabulary to sound smart. Moffat writes Sherlock as us being outside of his head, looking on the outside. This is essentially like trying to look inside a building through the wall. There's just so much distance between us that the lackluster writing of Sherlock feels smart, but because of the distance and the lack of reasoning that we're able to see or understand, we stand there looking like John Watson. We don't understand why or how Sherlock is Sherlock. In Psych, since we are given a look into Sean's mind as he recreates the crime scenes, and his line of sight to look over the details, it helps us follow along and makes the narrative easy to follow. So, I've complained about one scene, is that all? No, it's not. Another thing that makes zero sense is how Moriarty plans things. In the episode with a noble and his exotic garden, I think it's like episode 4 or whatever, I don't remember. Moriarty decides to help a couple who lost their child to disease. There wasn't a doctor available, and the noble who basically employs them didn't grant them access to his personal physician. The kid dies, the couple are ruined, and hold the noble in contempt. The gardener and his wife ask for Moriarty's help, and Moriarty agrees. Now, as they plan a visit to the nobleman's estate as guests, Moriarty spends time in the library reading. Then, as we are at a party, we see that they are gathered in the garden. The gardener and his wife are juicing grapefruits. The discussion begins by offering the nobleman biscuits of some kind with either grapefruit jam or marmalade, not really specified. As he begins having some sort of adverse effect, he calls for the doctor, but Moriarty says, "Oh no, don't bring him." As he's dying, Moriarty begins to explain that the drug that the noble's personal doctor has prescribed him has a bad side effect if mixed with grapefruit, due to a small chemical in the grapefruit that makes the mix deadly. Now, here's the issue. We learn of Moriarty's plan as the noble is dying and get flashbacks to Moriarty reading a book that I guess either explains the chemicals in the grapefruit, explains the chemical reaction to the doctor's drug and other chemicals. Honestly, it's just not specified and it doesn't really matter. We know Moriarty saw the garden once and then left. He talked with the gardener, though it probably talked with him off screen about the stuff, but there isn't anything shown to us on how Moriarty thought of killing the noble with grapefruit specifically. Between the meeting with the people involved and the actual killing, all we saw was Moriarty walking in a library. For all we know, that from what was shown in that previous scene, he could be looking for French lithographs or whatever passed for fan fiction back in the day. This scene, although it shows Moriarty doing something, doesn't give any idea to us what is happening. Moriarty is a curious man of learning. He's a teacher in a college, so it's kind of a given he'd be looking for interesting reads to learn something. That's what a stereotypical academic does, look for more information and learn things. And since this is the Victorian era of England, surprise, surprise, the internet didn't exist back in the late 19th century. It feels almost obviously given that Moriarty would be reading books in his free time. In other words, we didn't know what was going to happen until it did. And when it did, I felt disheartened. There's this whole how is he going to do it vibe. And that's it. We just had to assume he's planning things and go with it. Not to mention the payoff felt pretty strange. Grapefruit's a commonly known fruit that this noble didn't even know was edible. Yeah, I doubt that somebody amassing a garden wouldn't know what was in it. Was killed because it had a chemical that reacted badly to his medicine. Look, it doesn't need to be over the top, sure, but it just made the nobleman look so stupid that he spends so much money on plants that he hires an entire family to take over and care for a garden, and he doesn't even know what they do. To me, it just fell apart. This is a noble. Anybody who's got any rich, pretentious person, or heck, I will throw myself under the bus. If I have a fancy plant that I can eat from, I'm using that to cook with my guests if I bring somebody to my house. If I just have fancy plants, fancy ingredients, or something interesting, yeah, I'm showing it off. If you have a fancy garden, wouldn't you try to also ask your gardener, hey, what's edible from this? What can I make as an exotic dinner? Seriously? It just discredits the nobleman from being a complete actual idiot. But again, because of how it fell apart, I was just more confused than I was interested or impressed at that point. But let's see what I could do in the same situation with an exotic garden of beautiful plants amassed from around the known world at the time. One of the plants I researched is the Aconitum napellus, commonly called monkshood or wolfsbane. This species is native to Western and Central Europe. A man with a large garden may have many rare and interesting plants, and this would be a very rare and interesting flower to have as it has a actually quite interesting design, and people do own and keep these plants. It's very common. Ingestion of 20 to 40 milliliters of tincture can be lethal, and contact with leaves to bare skin also causes easy absorption that in very rare, and I mean very rare cases, has led to organ failure as a result. It's mostly just irritation, but the fact that it has been documented before in I'm just going to throw out a random number of 1% of the studies. It's not common, but it has been documented before. Another deadly plant native to Central and Southern Eurasia is Atropa belladonna, i.e. nightshade. According to history, Scotland's King Duncan I in 1030 poisoned a group of invading Danes with wine made by the deadly nightshade plant. He leveled an army without raising a single sword. Its berries have a sweet taste, and the toxins inside lead to its effects of the involuntary muscle paralysis, including heart muscle. Physical contact with the leaves can also lead to skin irritation. Another plant native to Africa fits even better. Ricinus communis, or castor beans, is a plant that is widely grown as ornamental. While processed seeds are the source of castor oil, they naturally contain the poison ricin and are deadly in small amounts. How small? It is generally stated that 1 to 2 beans can kill a child, and up to 8 will kill an adult. Interestingly enough, these beans have been mailed to many US politicians on a failed terrorist assassination attempt, which, can I just say as a side note, what was the plan behind that? You sent beans to a stranger. If someone mailed me beans, I'd be confused. I might throw them in a greenhouse, I might throw them in a garden. I definitely would not eat random beans that were mailed to me. But back on track. Arbus precatorius, or rosary peas, are another tropical alternative. Again, if this dude was growing plants for ornamental use in his greenhouse, he might have a tropical section or a greenhouse. Any of these plants are famous for their toxicology, and either grow near the UK or are known to be beautiful plants. Imagine if the noble who was shown to be ignorant of his plants had an obsession, or at least a partiality to one of these plants. Now, it may not seem as clever as grapefruit mixes bad with a drug, but there's so much more that could have been narratively woven for a better picture than, oh, I didn't know you could eat grapefruit. Like, imagine a pious Catholic noble whose favorite plant is rosary peas. He's in the UK, a country that historically has not been very close with the Catholic Church. He's what the countrymen, religious leaders, and commoners hate. He's the embodiment of things the English disliked, and for extra measure, you could even make him half French. Now you can weave a better narrative and have a more unique design for a noble that gives us, and the people in the universe, even more reasons to hate this man. But sure, grapefruit. Now, I know it is kind of late to say this, but yes, I am aware that quinine, or however you pronounce that drug, and the grapefruit situation is based in real science, and yes, grapefruit does mess with it. It's subtle and it is interesting, though the show doesn't really explain it that well, and I actually had to go out of my way to do some research to find out about it, but the subtle science behind it, I'm not against it as a grapefruit murder. There's just no setup for it, and that's kind of where it fell through. They mentioned this miracle drug, and then grapefruit a few minutes later. There's nothing really that goes into it. If there isn't really going to be a lot of a setup outside of that, then I advise something more flashy for the kill in a narrative sense. However, the grapefruit feels more like a MacGuffin as well, considering how the narrative is set up, more than a natural item that would have been found in the garden. For poetic points, if we're going to go for a flashier kill a Viscount with the name Lupin with Wolfsbane. Kill a pious Catholic with the rosary peas, or even a man in love with wine and who has an extensive wine collection by using wine with nightshade, as King Duncan I had done to protect Scotland, a country to the north of the UK. Well, in the north of the UK from the Danes. But the whole setup and details are aristocrat bad. Let's kill him with a fruit that has a chemical that is naturally a bad mix with 19th century miracle drug. Although it does make historical sense, the pacing and details cause it to be baseline interesting, but not poetic or very interesting. There isn't any punch to the end of the episode. It feels like Moriarty just checked off bag of salad from his shopping list. It feels boring and mundane and doesn't feel like it carries the weight of actually murdering a man in his own house. So, going off of that, Moriarty is killing the nobles and dismantling the aristocratic system by his will and his own sense of justice. Yet there isn't any ironic or poetic justice for the first bit. It's just the message of the story is aristocrats are bad, and when they are bad, they should be killed. It feels flat and doesn't have any additional driving force. Unless if you're curious enough about quinine and a grapefruit really would set off the drug in that way it did, then maybe you might do some extra research, but it just feels mundane. Now, of course, I rip on the grapefruit man mostly because the issue is, this show feels like that whole part just felt pretentious and made it look smart, but it never shows its genius. But after these episodes, the series actually jumps up in quality, which is why I'm ripping on this episode so hard. Because credit where credit is due, in the noatic arc, there is a lot of things a lot better with poetic justice, dramatism, and of course, showing Moriarty planning literally anything. For a basic breakdown for this part of the arc, they are on a ship and have one goal in mind. They are targeting a noble who is famous for hunting people on the grounds of his estate. They're taking a story that I remember reading in middle school called The Dangerous Game or something like that for the crimes of the noble in question. Quick check. Whoops, sorry, it's actually called The Most Dangerous Game. Anyways, back on track. To expose this man's lunacy and God made me better than thou, rabble attitude, they have a plan to set him up to frame him in front of everyone. So they hire a dude to antagonize the noble, which leads to the noble eventually killing him. After said victim is murdered, Moriarty visits and says, let's dump the body off the side of the ship. They do so, and Moriarty's men are below and collect the body. After a while, as everything's good but the noble is on edge, they plant the body to make it appear that it's in the front row of a ballet. This causes the paranoia from the noble to make him leave and interrogate or make a deal with his previous victim. He makes it down, no dice, the body is gone. He follows this new phantom to a lower part of the ship, where he finally finds the body through sheer paranoia, and and begins to make sure that the body is dead. He stabs it multiple times and goes a little crazy, as anime makes all murderers go. And as he's furiously stabbing this corpse, the platform under the stage is lifted up to show the entire ship that the noble has killed a man. Before much can be said or done, he declares himself above all life and flaunts his self-perceived superiority. This is alarming, but then we cut to some other nobles who bring up the rumor that he hunts people on his own land. He's arrested, and we hear that there may be an investigation on his property to look for victims. We then hear a few bodies have been planted there on the grounds on his estate for good measure. Sherlock leaves the ship and advises on his suspicions to Moriarty about the body being very cold, showing that the body hadn't been murdered on that stage, rather much earlier. Moriarty takes an interest in this and menacingly strolls off with plans for Sherlock. Now, this arc doesn't show a lot of planning or preparation in the more before this all gets executed. Instead, it shows them executing the plan from the shadows as it happens. So you learn of the plan and then you see them actually take action. But as this goes on, I actually like how this works out, because as they're enacting the plan with a mysterious premise of how are they actually going to frame the dude? Because so far the cycle we've seen happen a few times before, we know what they're trying to do, but now we watch them perform for the surprise ending. This is how this anime portrays its best mystery. We have knowledge on how things are supposed to go down. We know the goal. But as the audience, we don't know the full result and we don't know the journey. We just know the intended destination. As mentioned, this is the best arc in season 1. After that, it's when we shift to the rest of the season, where we see some time as Sherlock in his perspective in the retelling of A Study in Scarlet. Better deduction than Sherlock's A Study in Pink, but that's not a high standard in all honesty. But let's retrace our steps. Instead of only complaining about this show, though, I kind of want to go back and break down the first episode that I think encapsulates this entire series in general, and highlights the pacing issues you see in the beginning of season 1. The opening scene on episode 1 introduces us to an inconsequential character in New York of 1911, most notably a boy who likes to read detective stories and is late for something but doesn't want to go because he's getting into the good part of the book. The adult, who looks like he has some sort of police occupation due to the uniform, picks up the book, and we then see that the child is reading a book about the person who confounded the great Sherlock. And the opening credits roll. Now, I don't like this transition, mostly because we didn't see the characters, and it sets up a fictional world instead of another fictional world. In other words, this beginning section is useless information that we never touch on again. We open to a super dark, red overlay sequence, and a young boy is being chased. And then stuff happens off screen, and I just assume it was at the very least murder, and I'm hoping nothing more, but again, since it all happens off screen, it's up to you to decide. After that, we see Moriarty and his brother talking about the string of murders of children happening recently, talk offhandedly about omelets, and then we refocus on the murders. Moriarty first deduces that the children were all in occupations or found in common areas that would allow them to be publicly seen by many people, throwing the phrase, "people want what they see." He also deduces that the majority of the children being from occupations of fancier titles, such as a jeweler, a watchmaker, tailor, and stable for a coach. That the culprit was most likely a noble. However, one of the children was an orphan, which seems strange. So Moriarty decides to go investigate the area he was normally seen at. He finds a child who, quote-unquote, took over his friend's business, and sees where the orphan used to play in the streets, and sees that there's a fine cuisine club for nobles that overlooks the area with one particularly pronounced window. Anyways, from there, Moriarty brings up the club with his two brothers, one who has connections from the inside, and the next jump cut shot is Moriarty in the club asking about a certain Earl who is currently sitting by the window. So his brother's connections and everything else about getting him in the club was done off screen. Kind of gotta get used to that part. And Moriarty finds out that the Earl regularly sits in that window seat when it's available and decides to speak with the Earl. He asks the Earl about his suit and ring and throws out the name of the stores where he purchased them from. The Earl verifies the locations, and then Moriarty, without seeing the pocket watch, also states the name of the business of the watch store. The Earl also agrees, and then Moriarty subtly starts hinting at other stores that the Earl regularly visits, and hints at the type of meat that the Earl prefers. The Earl's face shows his discomfort and annoyance at Moriarty, and then excuses himself. The next shot is Moriarty being followed by a random guy, ambushes that guy in an alleyway, and then says he's going to interrogate him. This also happens off screen because the next shot is a carriage, and then a small room in a mausoleum in the cemetery. We went from an alleyway to the carriage, then to the room in the cemetery where the Earl is tied up. Enter Mr. Eden with one of his pairs of scissors. Quick flashback to introduce Moriarty as a crime consultant, and then murder happens off screen where we see Moriarty smoke a cigarette. Cigars are better. And Mr. Eden walks out covered in blood. And then the upbeat pop song they have for the end credits plays as Mr. Eden happily works in his shop. Fade to credits. So a lot of things that normally would have been somewhat interesting to see happen off screen. This doesn't have to be shown, but we were jumping from place to place with little idea of what was really happening and with little of context of why until it was explained. Again, I don't like this style because if you have to tell us instead of showing us what's happening at a pace we can process, cinematography is useless. In a visual medium where our eyes can process the majority of what's happening, it just doesn't help. With this, we could guess at the beginning of the show about the not subtle murderous rage of Mr. Eden, and we all knew that Mr. Eden was a father who's going to get revenge, as his son was shown to be the latest victim in the beginning of the episode, and we saw his pupils dilate in one shot, showing a sinister desire for vengeance. However, that is the issue. We're not shown clear ideas, and the show is structured that as we watch the episode, we have to carefully follow the dialogue to follow what's happening. As little was foreshadowed in the episode besides Mr. Eden's eventual rage and desire to kill his son's murderer. It's understandable, yes, but also that's basic. But this episode, like most others, feels rushed. The story arcs that take 2 episodes normally are more fleshed out, but the 1 episode arcs feel hollow, rushed, and are shallow. You jump from place to place like a combat-heavy level of COD, even though Call of Duty or Halo 3 ODST knows when to slow down to let you process what's happening. ODST especially shows more than it tells for its story, and that game has an interesting plot as well. However, jumping back to on topic, this show has the jumping power equivalent to a jumping spider. Anybody who's seen those little things know they can jump far considering their size, and that's a major killer of Moriarty the Patriot as a show. The runtime is so little that some stories are just rushed and have little build-up and almost no contextual clues to follow. We just get told what's going on as things happen because there isn't enough runtime in a standard episode length to show all of these details, or some people may say there isn't enough runtime. However, this first episode starts off with an inconsequential opening of characters we don't even see again, and then plays both the opening and end credit songs. If the first episode of Moriarty the Patriot did the same as many other animes do in their first episode, they could have instead had the show open up with its own intrigue of the murder as the initial hook. The entire episode could have been played out, and then some other quick scenes to convey certain events that happened off screen could have been quickly shown to establish the flow of the show and could have carried the dark and serious tones. A man murdered a murderer. The show should have kept the more darker, serious tone of this reality. Murder shouldn't be played off as vengeance is all I needed to recover from my son's loss. Then the opening song in animation plays, ending the first episode. That would have been a much better structure, and then as the murder of a murderer isn't treated lightly, the show is introduced with its dark theme and elements by the perfect opening song. Seriously, Dying Wish by Tasuku Hatanaka is the perfect song for the series, and as a guy who regularly skips anime intros, I never skip the opening to this song. It's that good. The animation for the opening song is also masterful, however, this anime does not live up to the expectations shown and set up by the opening credits. If you don't know how it looks, pause the video and look up Dying Wish and find Moriarty the Patriot opening credits video and go with that. It was published on YouTube. Do it now. If I can, I'll put a link in the description, but go do it. It's just that good. Continuing on in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, back on topic. I think I've made my point on why I think the pseudo-intelligence of the show put me off, and I mostly equate this to mismanaged runtime and execution. The show could have easily been a 9 out of 10. On my anime list, it's listed as an 8. But the final product doesn't deliver as much as it should to deserve that credit in my opinion. But enough about my issue with the story's details and pacings, let's focus on some positives. The character design for this anime is fantastic for the main cast. Moriarty is given what I'd classify as the anime British vampire look. His vibrant red eyes and blonde hair give him a villainous vampiric look that really suits him. It feels like an aristocratic design, however it plainly communicates that Moriarty is a villain, plain and simple. His goal is noble, but even he admits that what he does is against the current law of the land. His brother has a black butler feel to him, and by that I mean he's a very able butler of the 3 Moriarty brothers. Louis. I have no idea how I'm supposed to pronounce his name, so I'm choosing Louis since they're in England. I originally watched the show in sub, so I didn't pay attention to how they pronounce his name. His design shows his blood connection to Moriarty, but doesn't present him as regal as Moriarty. His design shows a little bit more humility, as if he knows he's playing second fiddle to his brother, and won't be as prominent as the rest of the cast. Now, Albert Moriarty is the only Moriarty in the show that had the true Moriarty name since birth. His overall design shows him as a conflicted human, a true noble, but not an outright villain like his younger brother, William James Moriarty. His design shows him as a more realistically colored human with a more down-to-earth brown tone for his hair. However, he regally holds himself like a true aristocrat. He's kind and benevolent, like we imagine and wish all the 1% were like. However, his true insidious nature is in full faith and belief in his brother's ideals that coincided with his when they first met as children. He has had the same anarchist or purge type goal as William, but Albert never had faith, or at least wasn't clever or committed enough to work towards that ideal alone. William's charisma gave him the hopeful push he needed to commit to the plan. Sherlock's design is also phenomenal. Unlike the well-kept aristocratic Moriarty family, he is disheveled and not fully a part of the aristocratic society. He is smart, but his long hair held back in a ponytail, his lack of a tie show him to be a more casual and straightforward individual. He isn't there for pretentious reasons. He does what is necessary in his pursuits as a more common and plain man. Watson is a nice compliment, showing a more middle-class type suit with a bowler hat style and a cane. It shows his standing in society, the fashion he can afford, making him appear more proper and educated to talking to, and within higher society compared to Sherlock, but not so much or not as fancy as the Moriarty family. The same can be said for Moriarty's two helpers, as they'll call them. Their design is more similar to Sherlock's, showing a more common man. They aren't in high society, mostly indicated by the lack of ties, open shirt collars, marking them as lower class, which this whole anime is about class systems and the issues with hierarchical societies. And so by showing where the main character stands within that society by their clothing designs really shows the full potential and thoughtful details that went into this design and for this series. Again, this is one of the stronger parts of the anime in my eyes, and the character design alone and the opening theme is fantastic. So basically, to summarize what I've tried to explain in this video, Moriarty the Patriot is a decent anime with pacing issues and a lack of detail and build up in the smaller arcs of the story that bring it down. Overall, it's an anime with a lot of potential because it was fantastic in some parts and absolutely lackluster in others. And I hope it becomes a lot better, as there is a second season if I'm not mistaken. Overall, I have 2 ratings for shows that I normally try to throw on, a critical score and a passive viewer score. Critically, I'd give the show a solid 6 out of 10. It's super good in some parts. The noatic arc is phenomenal. The study in Scarlet is decent, and the way they set up the characters, the way the character design works, phenomenal. The problem is the smaller arcs, the 1-episode arcs, and the backstory just kind of killed the momentum, some of the pacing. It just neglected so many small details that it just killed half of the season. If I could give you supercut, I would literally just tell you to avoid the first few episodes and go straight to the noatic arc, and after that is where the story begins and is actually good. But as a casual viewer, if you're not going to be a nitpicking asshole like myself, enjoyment is decently a 8 out of 10. Watching the show is a fun time. It has really great moments that are fantastic to see unfold. The characters are great, the animation and the art style is very appealing. I enjoyed it and binged the first 11 episodes, and I am hoping for more. Again, I know I was harsh on this show, but that's because I can see some real potential for the show because it shows its strengths with the noatic arc, especially. This show could easily be a 9 out of 10, maybe a 10 out of 10, but again, it's those small offhand episodes that really bog down the entire series. So with that being the case, hey guys, just editing this real quick, and I wanted to clarify because I didn't really do a very good job of explaining it earlier. The reason why I'm rating the show so lowly is only because if half the episodes in this season are good and the other half to me feel bad, that's kind of why I'm rating it so low. It's one thing if you can make a few good episodes, that's fantastic. But if your goal is to make an entire season in this case, and only half that season feels good, that's kind of why I'm docking it. Because you can have a fantastic episode in the middle of 12 episodes, but if the other 11 don't feel as good, it's not a good season. You had a good episode, a good arc. That's kind of how I'm treating this right now, is just, yes, the noatic arc, as well as the Study in Scarlet and the Murder Train episodes, those are really good. I like those a lot. But the fact that only those episodes are good and the other ones I would rate between a 5 to one of them being a 4, it's just, I can't rate this higher than really a 6 critically. I understand a lot of people might think that's controversial, but again, if you make an entire season and only half that season's good, you didn't make a good season for a show, you made a few good episodes. But you can't do hit or miss and consider that true quality. Just wanted to clarify that just before I left. In case this is just kind of my opinion though, if you disagree with me, let me know what you thought of the anime. Again, I urge anybody who hasn't seen this series to watch it. It is good, but not great. But I seriously do recommend it just to about anyone really. Unless if they're like me and nitpick details, which is why I haven't really watched Sherlock in a very long time, even though I really like Benedict Cumberbatch. Anyways, I'm a degenerate. No one asked. And I hope you have a good day.